Okay, so continuing from the last hour, we're talking about the Drake equation, all the different elements that we think are required to quantify or to estimate the probability and the number of foreign alien civilizations capable of communication and that we should be discovering in the galaxy. We talked about the first element, stars, and how many of them there are, and how many of them might actually be relevant for the type of system that we're looking for, a stellar system that can have planets. So where do planets come from? We talked about star formation a few weeks ago, and we said or mentioned that when the cloud or cloud of protostellar material exceeds its Jeans mass or Jeans radius or whichever Jeans parameter you would like to consider, it will form nucleation centers and will start collapsing. As it collapses, typically it would have some residual angular momentum. And that angular momentum will prevent it from a spherical collapse into a spherical body. It will typically cause some disk to form, with the axis of rotation of the disk being the axis of the excess angular momentum. Whichever net angular momentum you have in surplus, that will determine the plane of the disk. And we can see this, for example, in kind of this plot from the 60s, which calculates the average angular momentum per unit mass in a star for different star types. And we see that as the mass grows here logarithmically on the right, typically the angular momentum per unit mass grows, but that there is some break in the plot. We see that the heavier stars here represented by their AJR classification or their Harvard classification from O-type stars through B down to the higher A's and then F and G stars. We see that our sun, which is a G2 star, kind of fits along this broken line, which means that these stars, these smaller stars, have less angular momentum on average per unit mass than you would have expected from these large stars. If you extrapolated this higher line from the heavy stars down to the left and bottom, you see that it would pass above what we actually find observationally for stars. Asked another way, you can ask, why do these small stars have so much less angular momentum than they should have had if they followed the same power law as the heavy stars? And the common answer today is that we expect all of this missing angular momentum not to be missing, just to be missing from the star. Basically, it means that we expect this angular momentum to be given or to be shared by partners, either binary stellar systems or a planetary system. A planet is a great way to dispose of extra angular momentum because they're so far away from the main star. They don't even need to have a lot of mass to be able to rotate at a very large radius and keep a lot of the angular momentum of the system themselves. So it's a very good or comfortable way, a very accessible way to for a star to collapse by removing or shedding excess angular momentum off to planets, to planetary companions. And you have a homework exercise about exactly this in our solar system, calculating where or who in our solar system actually is responsible or holds, in some sense, most of the angular momentum of our solar system. And it's not necessarily the sun. It's actually the planets which have most of the angular momentum, specifically the big ones. So we think planetary formation is actually a useful process. And so we think that for the relevant types of stars close to G, so maybe F or M type stars, which are in the right kind of size and luminosity regions for being hospitable to life, we expect them to actually favorably produce planets. So that's fortunate from one perspective. We expect planets to be, this FP to be quite high. Another thing that we can do with this expectation of FP, fraction of planets or of stars having planets to be high, is to search for them. And this has been a long project in astrophysics, or at least a recent long project. Search for binary systems to find planets. And these searches for planets are ongoing, and they're very successful. And you can basically think of them as following all of the same methods which we covered last week when we talked about variable stars, in particular, extrinsic variables, binary systems. So as you remember, we have eclipsing binaries, spectroscopic binaries, astrometric binaries, and photometric binaries. And if you remember, they differ by how can we find either the presence or actual light from the partner. So if we can actually see the partner, that's a photometric binary. If we can only see the movement of the primary changing because the secondary is there, it's an astrometric binary. If we can see the effect of the secondary on the spectrum of the primary, it's a spectroscopic binary. And if we actually see, fortunate enough to be kind of on the disk, on the plane of the disk of rotation, that we can see the secondary blocking or eclipsing some of the primary, reducing the light of the primary, then it's an eclipsing binary. And so all of the search techniques developed for planets are basically looking for these different types of binary effects, either by studying the light of the primary, eclipsing, spectroscopic, astrometric, or if we're very, very lucky, photometric. And these searches have what once considered science fiction are today quite successful. From 1990, we had the first planet identified outside of our own solar system, of course, and it was around a pulsar. So we saw a pulsar's light change because a planet was surrounding it. So this is kind of an example of what would have been a stellar system with a star and a planet around it, but the star aged, evolved, died, left behind a pulsar, probably in a process of a supernova in between, but some of the planets survived, and we have a planet identified revolving around the pulsar. A live system of a planet around a main sequence star was first found in 1995. The star is called 51 Pegasi, so it's the 51st star in magnitude in the constellation of Pegasus, about 50 light years away. And that was a complete breakthrough in our understanding of exoplanets and basically the hard evidence that these exist. It's the final answer to the philosophers, and we talked about in the first hour, the philosophers who proposed that these exist, the church who thought that they could not exist. We found a planet around the main sequence star, 51 Pegasi, 26 years ago now. And this gave birth to multiple projects aimed specifically, telescopes and satellites aimed specifically at hunting for planets. You have I put on the Moodle website a link to a song, kind of a video song about planet hunting and the history of the field, which I recommend you watch. It's only a few minutes and has a Disney theme. Today we already know of thousands of planets, about 4,000 planets found since this first identification of 51 Pegasi. Most of them, along a big majority, with a specific mission, the Kepler Space Telescope. Kepler, named after, of course, Johannes Kepler, who studied the solar system, with one of the first telescope users. The Kepler Space Telescope, now decommissioned, was designed to hunt for planets, to follow these different methods of planet hunting or binary system hunting, and it discovered about 2,500 planets during its years of operation in about 1,000 separate systems, which means, of course, there are many stars which do not have planets or for which we have not detected planets, but that there are also many systems which have more than one planet, similar to what we know, of course, from our own solar system, which has, depending on how you count, 8 or 9 planets, plus asteroids and other objects surrounding it. So Kepler has started finding more and more systems which look a lot more like our own solar system with exoplanets. Kepler is no longer in operation, but it has 2 successor missions, missions that took its place, the Spitzer mission and the TESS, whose acronym I don't remember. It's, I think, Terrestrial Exoplanet Search something, or something of that form. And these are, again, arrays of space telescopes and Earth telescopes looking for planets. Another interesting development in the field, among those thousands of planets we've discovered, is just from a couple of years ago, to 2019, we found planets around a binary star system. So it's no longer just a star with a planet or planets around it. We have a binary star system, which also has a planet around it. In this case, it's a planet on what's called a p-orbit, a pair orbit. So it surrounds both of them. So we have 2 stars surrounding each other, and the planet on a further outside, a more external circle, circling both of them as one in some sense. Planets are so common that it now turns out we finally have the technology to find out that even our nearest neighbors in the galaxy, the star Proxima Centauri and Bernard star, which we mentioned earlier in the semester as kind of our nearest neighbors, they also have planets. So our nearest star, the star closest to us in the sky, about 4.3 light years away, has planets around it. And there's actually a mission now to go there, or at least to send a probe there. It's called the Breakthrough Starshot mission, led by Stephen Hawking as the scientific brain behind it, but joined by a lot of funding by Yuri Milner as the main contributor, and I think Mark Zuckerberg was also involved. It's kind of a big project which has drawn much attention. The Harvard Center for Astrophysics is also involved in this project, sending a probe within our lifetime, within the next 10, 20 years, to the nearest planet outside our solar system around Proxima Centauri. So these planets are starting to be ubiquitous. We find them basically everywhere where we look hard enough and where technology is good enough for that to find them. So today we estimate, again, we can't know for sure, but we estimate this FP, the fraction of stars which have planets, to be order of 1, between 1/2 and 1. So this will not be the constraining factor. We expect a lot of planets. Any questions so far?
Yes.
Yes.
I was wondering again about the definition of a planet. Is it just basically a star that doesn't produce enough nuclear energy to be called a star?
Yeah, so we define a star as an astrophysical heavy object which is sustained in equilibrium between gravity pulling in and nuclear energy production, heating it up and pushing it outwards. And we saw that these stable nuclear production fusion processes start when the stellar core is hot enough, which is equivalent to a mass of about 80 Jupiters. So above 80 Jupiters, you'll have stable nuclear production, and so you'll have a star. And below 80 Jupiter masses, you'll have various types of failed stars or almost stars, short-lived brown dwarfs, or basically, if they're not producing any nuclear energy or any significant nuclear energy, planets. The heavier ones will be able to sustain a gaseous atmosphere, like the gas giants in our own solar system, Jupiter, Saturn, and others. And the even smaller ones will basically be large rocks, spherical rocks, with or without some atmosphere, like the Earth, Mars, Venus, and other planets. Of course, Mars has an atmosphere. As we know, it's about 100 times thinner than the Earth's atmosphere because gravity there is much weaker. Planets are also expected to be roundish or almost spherical, again, because of their self-gravity, as opposed to smaller objects, asteroids, planetesimals, dwarf planets, and smaller objects. When they're small enough, gravity might not be able to make them spherical. And so we see small objects which are non-spherical, but planets are typically in this middle range where they're heavy enough to be spherical in a stellar system, in a solar system. They should also clear debris of their environment, and you can have basically what we know from our solar system, a star with identifiable orbits of smaller planets around it.
And the definition of an exoplanet.
That was in the first hour. Exoplanet means it's external to our solar system.
Okay, thank you.
So if it's in our solar system, it's just a solar system planet. We know all of them, and we have known them for thousands of years. We're now discovering exoplanets, planets outside our own solar system. And people today are also searching for exomoons. So moons around planets in other stellar systems.
We also still find normal planets, though, in our solar system.
Can you repeat that?
We also find planets in our own solar system every once in a while, not only exoplanets.
Full-fledged planets in our own solar system are kind of hard to find. It was common. The planets from antiquity only went up to Saturn. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were discovered as solar system planets over about 200 years by perturbations and observations in our own solar system. So yes, there was a period of finding new planets in our solar system. Today, that doesn't happen so much anymore. We expect to have found the big objects, the objects which cleared their surrounding of debris. So we don't expect any planets anymore, but we do find large asteroids or small, what today we might consider planetesimals or dwarf planets. And we find these, as we discussed earlier in the semester, we find these still in the Kuiper belt, in the outer outskirts of the solar system. Some of these planetesimals are actually bigger than what was considered planets. So the asteroid Ceres, for example, is larger than Pluto, but it's part of the asteroid belt. So there are many objects there, and it's not considered by today's definition, not considered a planet on its own. So today we find mostly smaller objects in our own solar system. Okay. The next parameter we discussed, it's not only enough for a planet to exist, the planet has to be positioned, the first thing we need is the planet to be positioned in the right region around the star. This is the parameter NE, number of ecosystem sustaining planets. And again, a planet cannot be too close to its parent star or host star because it will be too hot. And it can't be too far away because it will be too cold. It has to be in this Goldilocks region, which is broadly defined as the region in which water can be in liquid form. So our sun is a G-type star. We see it here below. And we can compare it, we can use it to normalize our scale. It has some X-ray radiance. We know that most of the sun's energy comes off in the visible range, but there is some tail of X-ray radiation. X-ray is dangerous, as you all know if you've ever taken an X-ray exam. It's an ionizing radiation. It can interact very strongly with molecules and atoms, and therefore it can break DNA and cause cancer and basically kill life or prevent it from developing very much. So we are looking for stars which have either planets around stars which either give very little X-ray radiation or have some other way on the planet to block that X-ray radiation. On Earth, it's our atmosphere, which screens a lot of the X-ray radiation, as well as UV, which is also could be dangerous and cancerous or carcinogenic. Our own ozone layer is what protects us on the Earth from the sun's UV ultraviolet radiation. So compared to our sun, a G-type star, and we can find kind of this habitable zone, the Goldilocks zone around the sun, planets which are not too close, so they're not too hot, and not too far, so they're not too cold. In our solar system, the Earth, of course, is basically in the middle of this habitable zone. We have liquid water on Earth. Venus is too close and too hot. You can't sustain liquid water and life on Venus, even though in other respects it's very similar to the Earth, similar in size, not very far away, but much too hot to sustain life. And Mars is arguably at the edge or past the edge of this habitable zone. Today it's too cold to sustain liquid water, but not by a lot. And as we'll see, there are other parameters which matter. If we look at smaller and hotter stars, so K and M type stars, K stars, recall the order is OBA, F, G, K, M. So K are slightly smaller than the sun, which makes them slightly colder, which means the spectrum is typically a little more orange than our sun. Give off less energy, and so we have that the habitable zone will be closer. You'll have to be closer to the parent star, to the host star, for the habitable zone. And even more so for M-type stars, the lightest and smallest and coldest stars, which are still on the main sequence above brown dwarf. So they're red stars, and the habitable zone here has to be very, very close to the parent star. So on the one hand, the smaller the star is, the closer the habitable zone has to be, and the more they're exposed to X-ray radiation. On the other hand, we expect them to be both to live a lot longer, because as we saw, the lifespan of a star grows very, very fast as the luminosity goes down, or the other way around. Heavier stars burn a lot faster and die a lot faster. And so we also expect these smaller stars to be a lot more abundant. There are many, many more M-type stars than K-type stars, and K-type stars than G-type stars. So when we try to estimate this number of ecosystem-sustaining planets or possible ecosystem-sustaining planets around stars, it depends on the star type, and of course, the more we have of them, the more we should look for planets around those in the habitable zone. Okay, so we mentioned the star type is the most prominent factor, and proximity to the star, because that determines the flux of energy reaching the star, which is basically what will determine the temperature of the star, which will say if you can have water and chemistry on it, or if it's too hot or too cold. Temperature is not everything, or more accurately speaking, the average temperature is not the only thing that's important. For example, if you had a planet which has a very elliptical orbit around the star, then even if most of the time it's within the habitable zone, if it spends, a few weeks or a month a year outside of the habitable zone, the temperature might be very, very strongly varying. It might happen that the planet gets twice as hot for part of the year, or twice as cold for part of the year. And it doesn't help that you have good conditions on average if half the time you're very, very hot and all water boils, and half the time you're very, very cold and all life freezes and dies. You have to be kind of a, almost circular or close to circular orbit to sustain stable conditions of habitability in a planet. And that requires both, for a single star, a circular or semicircular orbit. For a binary system or something more complicated, it's important that the system is stable. For example, here on the right, we see an example of planetary orbits around a binary system. And as we mentioned, we can have p-type orbits, which surround the pair of stars. So to them, it looks like there's just a center of mass which is being surrounded or being orbited. That's fine, it's stable. Or you can have an S-type star for a single star, an S-type planet for a single star, which is orbiting very, very close to one of the two companions. So effectively, it's on a stable circular orbit bound to a single star. Recall that between those two options, you cross the Lagrange points, which indicate instability in orbits which could just fly away either outside of the system or fall onto one of the stars, or in general have figure 8 shapes and other planetary orbits, which are very complex, therefore non-stable in conditions. So you don't expect to find life on kind of a figure 8 between two stars or in a very chaotic system. You also typically need your planetary orbit to be relatively clean of debris, which is why life developing on an asteroid or even on a planet-sized object surrounded by asteroids is less likely. You'd be constantly be bombarded by asteroids, which would destroy and heat up and block the sun and in other ways disrupt the evolution of life. We had enough of those on the Earth. Early on, we today think that the Earth was impacted or was crashed onto by a large body, which later broke off some of the Earth into what is now the moon. We know that periodic asteroids have been hitting the Earth. We know of a major one which hit 65 million years ago, causing the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, which in this case led to the evolution of mammals up to us. But generally being bombarded too often by asteroids is not something that would like to happen to develop stable life. There are other things that can happen and endanger life. Your position in the galaxy could be important. If you are near a part of the galaxy where many heavy stars are forming, then those stars will end their lives rather quickly and often, and those can cause either supernovae or what we'll see later, gamma ray bursts. And both of these can be quite catastrophic to life developing close by. So there's a proposition that the reason life developed in our galaxy, basically the ones that we know on the Earth, is exactly because the sun is kind of far from the center of the galaxy. So it's farther away from those catastrophic galactic events of massive stars forming and destroying things around them. So that's also important. Furthermore, you'd like the rotation, the spin rotation of the planet, which determines the day, and the length of the year, the rotation around the star, to be, again, not too long, not too short, and not too close to each other. If the day and the year are the same length or some small product of each other, which happens when you have tidal locking for very close planets, for example, Mercury or Venus. For example, the moon locked to the Earth, we always see the same face. In that case, you would have one side of the planet always facing the star and getting a lot of radiation, and the other side of the planet getting none. So again, you'd have the star not equally distribute temperature around it, but have parts that are very, very hot and very, very cold. And this is also a complication when you want to develop life. You have to kind of balance out or circulate the heat throughout the planet. An atmosphere can help to do this. An atmosphere helps circulate air and heat. Oceans and water also help to circulate heat. So that's good to have. And we have to consider these things when you're actually looking at how many stars are hospitable. We already mentioned that the atmosphere is also important in filtering ionizing radiation, UV and X-ray. So atmosphere is a very, very important factor in a star, in a planet for life. That is probably the most important factor in why Mars doesn't seem to have life, while it's not very far from the Earth. It has very, very low atmosphere, which causes two things. One of them is that there's no greenhouse effect, or very little greenhouse effect, which means the planet doesn't retain the energy it absorbs from the sun, which means it's a lot colder than the Earth, even though it's only slightly farther away from the sun. It's an atmospheric effect, which Yehu will cover more in the tutorial. And the other thing is that without a thick, good atmosphere, it's hard to maintain an equal temperature and filter out radiation and other things. These will all be important if we do want to colonize Mars, and all of these effects are a hindrance to us. Okay, and of course, the gravity of the planet, which is the size of the planet, determines how much atmosphere it will maintain alongside temperature. We already saw this plot here on the right bottom when we discussed black body radiation and Boltzmann distributions of particles. The temperature of the atmosphere will determine the average kinetic energy and velocity of various atoms and molecules in the atmosphere. The lighter ones will typically escape. So hydrogen and helium escape Earth's atmosphere. We are able to maintain heavier elements like neon, oxygen, carbon, etc. Mars is not able to do that. It has a much lower gravity, and so the atmosphere mostly evaporates away, and that's a problem when you want, again, to develop life and when you want heavy elements available for forming chemical and organic molecules. An example, after discussing all of the things that are difficult to find, is the Trappist system. This is a very recent system found by a planet hunting facility in Chile, the Transiting Planets and Planetesimals Small Telescope, or Trappist. Again, the telescope discovers planets by transitions. So by transiting a star, we can see that there is a binary there, and we can know where to look for a planet. And this is an interesting system because it's very, very similar not to our own solar system, but to the Jupiter system. The central star itself is quite small. It's only about 80 Jupiter masses, so it's just at the border between a brown dwarf failed star or a main sequence star. So it burns very, very slowly, produces very little luminosity. The edge of M-type stars. Accordingly, the habitable zone has to be very, very close. It can't be as far as the Earth. It can't even be order of astronomical units away. It has to be very, very close. And indeed, if we look at comparison to the solar system, we can see that the entire Trappist system would fit much closer than the orbit of Mercury. In fact, it's approximately the same size as the moons of Jupiter, the Galilean moons of Jupiter shown here for comparison. So if you consider the central point here as either the TRAPPIST-1 star or Jupiter, then you see the star itself is called, in a typical planetary system, the star will be A because it's the brightest object in the system, the central one. And then the planets are numbered outside, B, C, D, etc. And we have the 7 planets around TRAPPIST-1 with the innermost one, B, around the orbit of Io around Jupiter. So remember that this is something you can see from the Earth, and Galileo saw this. These are the Galilean moons, a separation which is quite close, but orders of magnitude smaller than our own solar system. The radius here to the furthermost planets is about 5 million kilometers. And recall that one astronomical unit, the radius of the Earth from the sun, is 150 million kilometers. So 30 times farther away. So it's a very, very small system with a very, very weak and cold star, but it does have multiple planets, about 7 planets, which we know of already surrounding this star. All of them have mass very close to the mass of the Earth. They are all very close, and at least 3 of them are in the habitable zone around this star. So we kind of have an artistic impression of what these planets might look like. We have no idea what the color really is or what the composition is, but we do have a notion of their sizes, more or less. And as you can see, the distances here are all about 1% or a few percent of an astronomical unit. So we're starting to find planets in the habitable zone. We're starting to find more and more of these when we look. And so combining together, we expect that not every star will have a planet, but most stars might have more than one planet, and most stars which do have planets might have more than one in the habitable zone. So our estimate today of this product, FPNE, the fraction of stars with planets times the average number of ecosystem-sustaining planets per star, is about order 1, between half and 1. That is, we expect the average star in the galaxy to have, on average, between half to 1 habitable planets. Okay, so if we have a lot of stars in the galaxy, and we mentioned that the star formation rate is 10 a year, the total number is 100 billion, we expect the same order of number of planets, of habitable planets in the galaxy. Any questions? Okay, moving on. Having a planet with an ecosystem is mandatory. You have to have a star, a planet, and the conditions for developing life in order to develop life. But here's a big uncertainty. We don't know whether having the conditions is itself enough. And this is a fierce scientific debate, which is both waged in scientific grounds and on philosophical and theological grounds, and societal and kind of cognitive levels. We don't know how hard it is to actually spark the beginning of life, even if all the conditions are there. Is it even possible as a random process? Or does it have to have some sort of external divine intervention, or do you need life to create new life? This is a very hard problem to solve and question to answer, because we actually only have one example of a planet where all the conditions were met and has developed life, which is of course our own Earth. And as far as we know, life only started one time on the Earth. And we know this, or we think this, because basically the genetic code of all life on Earth, from whichever bacteria or plant or fungus or anything you find on the Earth that's living, has almost the same genetic code. The same 4 building blocks, the same composition of amino acids, the same genetic code used to translate between DNA, RNA, and amino acids and proteins in developing life. So what we expect is that when life forms, and if life forms, because inherently life is a self-duplicating, self-replicating process, some would actually define life as this biological self-replicating process. Once it starts at some point with the proper conditions, it will quickly, exponentially spread itself all across the planet wherever the conditions are met. So life sweeps through a planet when it forms, which on one side means that once it starts, it's very likely to catch on and reach everywhere on the planet. On the other hand, it means that we only have really one example to study, because we only have one planet with life, and it's basically all the same from a biological perspective, or at least from an astrobiological perspective. The conditions were close enough and life just spread everywhere. We do find life under very extreme conditions, which again says that it might be easier to create than some would argue against. We find it in volcanic regions. We find it in the Arctic and under the water of the Arctic regions. We find life sustain itself in very, very extreme conditions. But still, we don't know if it formed there or just reached there or spread there from being created in more favorable conditions. So again, we don't know the answers to this. And the only thing we have at our disposal to study are the randomly occurring chemical and organic processes of organic chemistry, which grow in complexity from the basic atoms and molecules all the way down to what we have for life today: carbohydrates, amino acids, DNA, and much larger structures and polymers of biological material. So we have to talk about chemistry, chemistry in space, and how do we combine these different elements together to form organic and materials and biological materials. And before we can talk about chemistry in space, we have to talk about creation of elements in space. And that's called nucleosynthesis, the creation or synthesis of different types of nuclei, different types of elements. We expect that the Big Bang created, or as the Big Bang created and cooled down, we had basically quarks grouping together very, very early on to the first protons and neutrons, and basically formed the ambient hydrogen and helium composition of the universe. Approximately 70% of the mass of the universe we expect to be hydrogen, almost all the rest helium. That is about 90% or 90 and a little percent of atoms are hydrogen atoms, and about 9%, all the rest almost is helium. There are also trace amounts of isotopes like deuterium or slightly heavier elements like lithium, but basically almost everything from the Big Bang is helium and hydrogen. As we studied before in the course, stars are really the thing that produces elements. So the first stars from about 500 million years after the Big Bang were population 3 stars, and they converted hydrogen to helium, so increasing the amount of helium in the universe, and then moving on in the heavy stars to heavier elements, as we saw, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, all the way up to silicon and iron, and kind of populated more and more heavy elements. When these stars die in supernovae and other catastrophic events, they shed and explode, spread away those heavy elements into the universe, which are then used to create or to seed and join population 2 stars, which are the next generation of stars. And when these die, they produce population 1 stars like our sun, the stars that live in and are still active today. So the heavy elements required for chemistry and for organic chemistry are basically the product of previous generations of population 2 and population 3 stars, fusing heavy elements from the primordial ones over billions of years. Those elements can then start to group together and to form atoms and form molecules. This would typically happen in denser regions. So the random chance of 2 nuclei meeting each other out in the vacuum is not very large, but it does grow when you're talking about clouds of matter, which can, where there's more things to absorb them, then they can accrete onto accretion disk in a protostellar disk, forming eventually a stellar system with a star and planets around it, again, until it dies, mass goes away, and again spreads across the universe. This is how we think atoms and molecules have the basic ones reached places like planet Earth through this long chain of nuclear production in stars, explosions of stars, mass loss from stars, accumulation in clouds and on dust particles in space, accumulating on protostellar disks, and then forming into the Earth. We search for these, we don't just speculate, we search for these traces of different types of molecules in space. And we do this with spectroscopy, what we learned about, I think, in the third week of the semester. Just like atoms have their typical spectral lines, absorption and emission lines, which come from different electronic transitions in the atom emitting or absorbing photons of particular wavelengths and frequencies, molecules also can do that. And here we have a spectrum taken from space, looking at the Orion Nebula, so a lot of gas, and a region with stars and gas. And looking at the spectrum, we can identify many of these lines kind of jumping out of the flat spectrum, and we can associate them with simple molecules. So the most important one here is, of course, the water lines. We see three prominent lines indicating that there is water or water gas in the Orion Nebula. So that gas is not just helium and hydrogen. We actually have oxygen merging together with hydrogen to form water. So we have water in space. Another prominent water line is here on the right. We see that it's quite obvious. Small and simple organic molecules like methanol also appear. We see methanol lines here and on the right, maybe weaker, but at least it indicates that there's materials to work with. Different composites of sulfur. These are important in biology as well. Formaldehyde, ether, various cyanide products. So different small, simple bases for organic chemistry we have started to find in space, for example, in the Orion Nebula. And we find this with spectroscopy. This allows us to study the formation and the growing complexification of these molecules in space. And we have here, for example, kind of a layout of how these organic molecules might develop from the simplest elements, starting basically from just hydrogen and gas. We can have different processes, for example, cosmic ray ionizing the hydrogen atoms, forming an H2 plus ion. That ion is then very reactive or very active in attaching to other molecules. And so we can form an unstable hydrogen 3 molecule, which can then, again, unstable, merge or encounter and react with either oxygen, carbon, or deuterium. The deuterium line can then be replaced by nitrogen, and we have growing molecules or composites involving nitrogen, ammonia, and things like that. On the right side, we have successive absorptions of more hydrogens and carbons, so we can develop carbohydrates, pachmemot in Hebrew, develop on this chain on the right, and various water forming on the left by absorbing oxygen. So we're starting to map out different chemical processes in space and relating them to the molecules we need to form life: water, nitrates, and carbohydrates. On the left here is an example from a paper of mapping 4,500 different reactions which can happen in space, forming these complex networks and growing complexity of molecules. And we see some of them, for example, are attachment by cations, so hydrogen ions, positive ions. These are very common. Some less common phenomena might be attachment of electrons or formation of carbonitrates or cyanic molecules. And we're starting to map out all of these. Obviously, this is not a course in chemistry or in organic chemistry, but when we start doing astrobiology, you have to at least know kind of the basis that these things can happen in space, either out in random space by interaction, for example, with the cosmic rays, or more commonly on dust particles with dust grains and other interactions, which are kind of acting as as stimulus or as making these reactions faster and more common. These kind of researches were already done 70 years ago, both in kind of observing different types of molecules in space. And this, for example, is a search from the 50s done in the interstellar medium, again, looking for all of the basic elements that we expect to be crucial for life: water, ammonia, cyanic molecules, growing complexities of both carbohydrates and oxidized carbohydrates, that is different types of alcohol, and even up to simple amino acids. This has led scientists early on to consider, again, the question of whether just having these simple molecules available is both reproducible and is enough to create growing complexity of molecules. And this led to the famous Miller-Yuri experiment in 1953, which asked the question, given a primordial composition of an atmosphere of a planet, for example, methane, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and basic elements, will complex organic molecules form themselves by chance, randomly? And instead of waiting for millions of years, they sped up the process by introducing high voltage electrical sparks. This is supposed to kind of emulate lightning strikes in a primordial soup of matter and gas. And they did this, they electrocuted a mix of gases of water, hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and others, and counted how much molecules they could produce completely randomly, just by giving energy in this form to proto-organic molecules. And they found that they could. They could randomly produce small trace amounts of formic acids, glycine, alanine, various types of amino acids. So those of you who do have a background in organic chemistry can find here glutamic acid, aspartic acid, many, many types of amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, which are the building blocks of life. These can form randomly, and we've managed to reproduce this in a laboratory already 70 years ago. Okay, again, we don't know whether this itself is enough to produce life. Amino acids are a crucial step, but they're not all the way there. We have not yet produced a self-replicating chemical compound, which is basically life. But we're starting to think that if the amino acids can form by chance, maybe given long enough time, they will form some combination which is self-replicating. And once it's self-replicating, there you have life. And like I said earlier, all life on Earth today, mapped here on the right side, is basically traceable to the same building blocks, the same genetic material, the same basic molecular processes which replicate themselves. And so we do expect today that this is maybe a difficult process, but that given millions and billions of years, it will happen. In fact, looking back at life on Earth, we do find traces of organic material and of actual bacteria going back billions of years. Basically, immediately as soon, on a geological scale, immediately as soon as the Earth cooled down from previous asteroid impacts to conditions which resemble the conditions today, temperature-wise and habitability-wise, we almost instantly see the appearance of bacteria. And as we said, they immediately spread over the entire planet. So today we expect this FL, the fraction of planets hospitable to life, producing life, basically to approach 1. We expect scientifically, we expect life to appear wherever and whenever possible. Of course, it might take millions of years, but we do expect it to happen. A slightly more difficult question to answer is, would intelligence appear, this Fi? Here again, we're faced with the exact same problem. It only happened once, but we do expect evolution to play around the same way on different planets. We expect evolution to produce similar results to similar problems. We see this on the Earth. It's called convergent evolution. We see this in both mammals and fish developing in parallel, but producing similar shapes, like the dolphin shark is a common example. They look very similar, although they're actually evolutionary very, very remote from each other. Sensing organs of light, like eyes, are also very, very common across the evolutionary tree on Earth. And other phenomena which repeat themselves. We expect intelligence to be one of them as well. We expect intelligence eventually to develop in an evolutionary process when given the chance. The reason we only see one intelligent species on the Earth is, we think, because once intelligence forms, that species immediately occupies the entire planet, or immediately on an evolutionary scale. For humans, it took only a few tens of thousands of years to cover out of Africa, all of Europe, Asia, across to North America, South America, even as far as Australia and New Zealand. This all happened very, very rapidly once humans developed intelligence and began spreading, basically eradicating all large mammals which could have developed along a similar track. So we expect intelligence in this sense to be common, to occur, and to spread very, very quickly on the entire planet. So both FL and FI, the fraction of planets hospitable to life, developing life, and developing intelligent life, we expect to be around 1. Any questions? If not, let's take another break and reconvene at 2:20.